BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the Teespring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin. Okay, hello everybody. Today is Wednesday, and on Wednesdays this year, I've been doing a regular segment about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved murder mystery. Today I will be discussing the Jack the Ripper suspect Thomas Neill Cream, and in the majority of these episodes, I've talked to you guys about the facts of the case, and then looked at some of the theories that people have associated with them. But this one has to be done in somewhat of a reverse order, because I think the only way to share the story is by looking at the theory first, and then going back and looking at the additional information. Firstly, Dr. Thomas Neill Cream was a real-life Victorian serial killer, and I would like to give credit to the YouTube channel Faces of the Forgotten, which shared a very good timeline of his life. He was born in the city of Glasgow in Scotland, and in 1854 he went with his family to Canada. He went on to graduate from McGill University, and from a very early point in his life, he developed some socially deviant behavior, and I think he was a lifelong social deviant, and that is just evident in all of the crimes that not only he committed, but the ones that he was also suspected in. And before I say anything further, I would like to invite you guys to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, as well as visiting some links in the description box, including BuyMeACoffee.com, which allows you to make a donation to help the show, and anyone who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. But Dr. Thomas Neill Cream began to use his medical knowledge in some very destructive ways. He was performing illegal abortions, as well as doing very odd things with chloroform, and in multiple sources they talk about how the primary focus of his academic research was using chloroform in medical practices, and this is heavily connected to a series of deaths that he was not convicted for, because it seems like the early crimes of Thomas Neill Cream are ones where he is allegedly poisoning people, and they think that it's him. It's like he's the prime suspect in these cases, but they don't have the evidence to convict. And an example of this would be the murder of Catherine Hutchinson Gardner, who was found outside of his medical practice near an outhouse, who had died from chloroform poisoning, but of course he was not convicted for that one. Then, at some point, Thomas Neill Cream begins to commit the crimes using strychnine, and the strychnine poisoning is really what he is more well known for than the chloroform cases. And in 1881, he is sent to jail for committing a murder using strychnine poisoning, one of the only times that, or at least the only known times, that he actually murdered a male victim named Daniel Stott. And then when he is in prison, he is given a life sentence. I mean, when he's convicted, he's given a life sentence in prison. And this is where the theory comes into play. This is in 1881. And when was Jack the Ripper operating? 1888. Life in prison, right? In 1887, his father passes away and leaves him an inheritance of $16,000. And the theory is that his brother went to Illinois, he's actually in Joliet Prison in Chicago, Illinois, and paid a bribe to have Thomas Neill Cream let out of prison. So Thomas Neill Cream is let out of prison in 1887, goes to Canada to claim the rest of his inheritance, and then goes back to England and sets up shop again as an illegal doctor, an illegal abortionist, poisoning people, and he goes on to be known as the Lambeth Poisoner. And that is one marker on his Jack the Ripper profile that everyone should pay attention to. He was a real-life serial killer. But there is the big differentiation between the crimes associated with Jack the Ripper, in the sense that they weren't crimes that were done without physical contact. The Ripper was a very, very intense killer who mutilated the victims. but that could also be tied to the fact that Dr. Thomas Neill Cream is what? A doctor, a medical doctor, someone with anatomical knowledge who would have known how to locate organs like the kidney or the uterus or the heart and have a medical understanding of them. So I would like to give credit to Martin Fido, actually, who hosted the program Murder After Midnight. And last week on the channel, I told you guys I was going through those episodes, and he did one on Dr. Thomas Neill Cream. He's just talking about all of the Jack the Ripper suspects, actually, some of the famous ones, and there was a brief segment on Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, and he provided some very strong challenges to this particular theory. The first is that theory associated with his brother paying the bribe, maybe that actually happened, but the idea that it happened in 1887 prior to the Whitechapel murders is purely false, and it's just a pure fiction that he wasn't let out of jail until 1891. So then they would have to make this type of assumption that Thomas Neill Cream was let out of prison, and they forged the records to make it say 1891. The story is shared in two different ways, though. I read one variant of it that his brother paid the bribe to the prison officials, but even if you go on Thomas Neill Cream's Wikipedia page, it says that he paid the bribe to the governor. And that's just going to be depending on which source you would choose to believe in. When we're going back to the 1800s, a lot of these things are not super well documented. But, I mean, if the guy is in prison in Illinois, does that not rule him out completely? Well, there could be the 1891 timeline or the 1887 timeline. If he was let out of jail in 1887 and they falsify the records, that would be something in favor of his guilt as Jack the Ripper. But then there is a second theory, and that is that he had a twin or a body double, and this person was in prison. And I think that the word body double really misrepresents the story, because what it sounds like is that either 2 or 3 men have made this decision to use the same name and the same alias, and they're living under the name Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, or maybe even Thomas Neill, and they're sharing this identity so that they can't get caught. It's like if someone is suspecting them of being in this one place, then they're actually in this other place. Or there's also the theory that he had a twin brother that just nobody knew about. That makes absolutely no sense to me. You'd think that something, some way, somehow, somebody would have revealed that he had a twin brother, and it's actually his twin brother that's in prison in Chicago, and he's in England committing the Whitechapel murders. That just gets a little bit confusing, and I'm going to be very honest with you and share my 2 cents on the subject about those types of theories. Is it possible that someone was under the misapprehension that because he was in England in 1891, that he must have been in England in 1888, and they were unaware that in 1888 he was still incarcerated when they composed the theory, and then they learned some contradictory evidence. So what happens when true crime theorists learn contradictory evidence? Some of them incorporate it into their own theory. Oh, well, that's because his brother paid a bribe in 1887 to let him out of jail, and they falsified the records. So, like, they're just making up an explanation that fits their theory. It's trying to force the theory, the same way that somebody tries to force the square peg through the round hole. Dr. Thomas Neill Cream would go on to be convicted for 4 murders, but there's several different books that have been written about this particular case, and I was actually quite surprised at the number of people who have covered this story. And one of them is The Case of the Murderous Dr. Cream, The Hunt for a Victorian-Era Serial Killer by Dean Jobs, and there is an article about him in the Washington Post, and I would like to read that right now. These days, when we live in a world of mass shootings, the notorious murder cases of the Victorian era can seem almost cozy, and yes, it does say that, almost cozy. I have to throw in an interjection. I find that the more I read about Jack the Ripper and the more I read about Whitechapel, everything could not be further from the truth. The Victorian era does not seem cozy at all. It seems like a bunch of people who were living in poverty, who were living in terrible conditions, and I am amazed that so many people, so many of our ancestors, survived the Victorian era. Nothing cozy about it for half the population of England. The studies in Scarlet of William Ruffhead, the early 20th century grandmaster of true crime writing, evoke the same petty, round-the-fire atmosphere we are associating with Sherlock Holmes mysteries or classic ghost stories. We shiver a little or feel for the unfortunate victims and take another sip of our whiskey or hot cocoa. Well, there's nothing wrong with feeling for the victims, and there's nothing wrong with drinking hot cocoa. Perhaps only Jack the Ripper, the terror of London's Whitechapel district during the autumn of 1888, truly haunts our collective imagination because Saucy Jackie was never apprehended. His identity continues to invite endless, often far-fetched speculation. A few ripperologists even regard Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, the subject of Dean Jobs' The Case of the Murderous Dr. Cream, as a likely candidate, partly because the convicted serial killer and poisoner said the last words, "I am Jack." Alas, whatever Cream meant to say next is lost because the moment the scaffold's trapdoor opened, he passed away. There are a couple responses from this. The first is, I can't even tell you where I read this source, but someone said that perhaps the executioner made that up because he wanted to tell the story of how he had hanged Jack the Ripper. But again, I was listening to Murder After Midnight hosted by Martin Fido, and he said that the executioner who killed Thomas Cream went on to write a memoir, and there was no mention of that incident in the memoir. So he is proposing, I repeat, proposing that that is absolute fiction as well, that Thomas Cream never even said, "I am Jack," at the gallows. All attempts to link him to Whitechapel's atrocities, however, instantly are confronted with a seemingly immovable stumbling block. That grisly fall of 1888, Cream was serving a life sentence in the Illinois State Prison at Joliet. Case dismissed? ? Not necessarily. Undaunted, some true believers improbably contend that Cream had a twin or a double who took his place in prison. Still, would a knife-wielding slasher later alter his modus operandi to strychnine poisoning? This seems psychologically unlikely. I think that there are two immediate responses, as previously stated with Dr. Thomas Neill Cream. Firstly, it's not just so simple as just he has a body double taking his place in prison. It's that multiple people around the world with similar appearances, like maybe even three guys, are using the name Thomas Neill Cream, and they're committing crimes. They made some type of agreement. They're all sharing this identity. They didn't have electronic communications at the time. It would have been very easy to do. So they're downplaying that situation a little bit, but this whole thing about switching from strychnine poisoning and to going to murder and then back to murder and mutilations and then going back to strychnine poisoning, well, criminals don't follow the rules, and they also do not have to play by anyone's particular rule book. And, I mean, sometimes criminals will also experience an escalation in destructive behavior. Maybe there's an intense moment of rage, maybe it deals with something like their testosterone levels, maybe somebody like Dr. Thomas Neill Cream wasn't only giving out poisons, maybe he was also getting high on them, and that created some type of mental confusion in the 1880s. Whatever the truth is, Dr. Thomas Neill Cream proves Sherlock Holmes' observations that when a doctor goes wrong, he is the first of criminals, he has the nerve, and he has the knowledge. And I do have to share something on a personal note with you guys, and that is that you should never judge someone by their appearances. You should never judge someone just by the way they look. But the first time I ever saw a photo of Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, he was wearing the top hat. And, I mean, just looking at his eyes, I was like, this guy just looks sinister in the photo. I mean, and definitely because of his eyes. And I believe that he was cross-eyed, but he is probably trying his best to focus clearly in the photos. And in some of his photos, he doesn't appear to be cross-eyed, but there's just something sinister about his presence. Job opens his account of Cream's life and known crimes on the last day of July 1891, when this graduate of McGill University's medical school walked out of Joliet prison after serving a 10-year sentence for blackmail and murder. Following a quick visit to his well-to-do family in Canada, Cream then set sail for London, where he had previously pursued an advanced degree at St. Thomas's Hospital in Lambeth. He arrived there in late September or October. 2 weeks later, on October 13th, a young Lambeth prostitute named Ellen Dunworth took ill. Shaking and twitching in agony before she died, Dunworth told her landlady that a tall, dark, cross-haired-eyed man gave me something to drink, some kind of white stuff. A week later, on October 21st, another streetwalker, Matilda Clover, was found in her room, screaming in pain and racked by seizures. "That man, Fred, has poisoned me," she gasped. "He gave me some pills. The pills were supposed to be for a venereal disease," later reports would show. In both cases, the London police did nothing. Dunworth's death was put down as a suicide, and Clover's was attributed to alcoholism. That same October, a well-dressed gentleman wearing thick spectacles accosted Louisa Harvey outside the Alhambra Theatre. The two spent the night together, and he paid her an extravagant £3. The next day they met again and enjoyed some wine at the Northumberland Arms public house, which by now is called the Sherlock Holmes Pub, famous for its recreation of the detective's sitting room. Agreeing to a rendezvous at a music hall at 11 p.m., the kind gentleman who explained that he was a doctor gave Harvey 2 pills, which would clear up her spotty complexion. Before they parted, he insisted that she swallow them. Instead, Harvey was no fool. She palmed the pills and later dropped them into the river. In the evening, she waited for the doctor, but he never showed up. It was, writes Job, as if he had never expected to keep the appointment. And I know that's being a little bit theatrical, but that is a story that is shared in numerous other Jack the Ripper as well as Victorian websites talking about how he had tried to poison Louisa Harvey, but she figured it out that he was up to no good, so she actually throws the pills in the River Thames, and that's why she is not getting away with this. That's why he didn't get caught, excuse me. That same November, Cream was introduced to the respectable Laura Sabatini, and following a whirlwind courtship, she agreed to marry him. 2 months later, in 1892, her new fiancé briefly returned to Canada, and while there, noticed that a maid in his Quebec hotel looked a bit peaked. After trying one of the 2 pills Cream generously offered her, she experienced a burning pain in her stomach, and quite sensibly threw away the other. In March, the pragmatic doctor purchased a bulk order of various narcotics and poisons, mainly strychnine, from a New York drug dealer, and then booked a first-class passage back to London. Losing no time, in April, he managed to poison 2 more prostitutes, both on the same evening, quite similar to Jack the Ripper's double event. Finally detecting a pattern, the London police started to search for the mysterious cross-eyed medical gentleman, possibly known as Fred. And this is really only just the beginning of the story, but more or less he is apprehended, and then he is ultimately sentenced to death. But they ask a very big challenge question in this article from the Washington Post. Why did Thomas Neill Cream murder people? No one can say for sure, since the doctor maintained his innocence to the end and would admit only to occasional extortion schemes. Well, according to the other story, he also admitted to being Jack the Ripper, but that is somewhat of a story that doesn't seem to be extremely corroborated. But why did this guy commit the crimes? So, power, hatred of his mother if he's poisoning women, as well as just showing absolutely no regard for humanity. I mentioned earlier when I said he is a dark triad personality. He seems like a sociopath and a Machiavellian, someone who believes that he's superior and he doesn't have to follow the rules, and also showing absolute indifference to life, also committing murders to fuel his own excitement. That's my take on the subject. But I'm also going to share some things with you guys related to the Jack the Ripper case. We have the handwriting of Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, and what do you think? I'm going to put it up on the screen. If you're listening to this while you're driving or out running on YouTube Premium, I hope you'll get a chance to look at this, pause for a second, and just, do you think that this is similar to the other more accepted Jack the Ripper communications, the Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter? I think that his handwriting looks very, very different, but that's just me, that's just my take on the subject. And one of the final concluding notes that I will share with you is they actually made a stage play about his life called Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, and this was written and set in Canada, and it's paying homage to his alma mater, the University of McGill University. I thought that was rather odd, but as I said, an enormous amount of people have covered the story and the cases connected to Dr. Cream, the murder stories associated with this Victorian-era serial killer. But what I'm not seeing is a very strong Ripper connection. And is it possible, as I said before, that certain people were making the assumption that he was in England in 1888 because he committed crimes there in 1891, and they didn't go back and look at the records until it was too late, and they've already created this elaborate theory? Oh, well, his brother must have paid a bribe to get him out. Or maybe there was this group of men who were just sharing the identity of Thomas Neill Cream. Anything is possible, but I think he goes on the lower end of the suspect ratings. What do you think about Dr. Thomas Neill Cream as a Jack the Ripper suspect? What do you think about any of the ideas discussed in this episode? And feel free to visit some links in the description box. You can also check out the merchandise, look at the book Killer on a White Horse, and if you would like to support any of these efforts for Black Box Online Radio, you can support the show at BuyMeACoffee.com, BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNet88. There's a link to that down below as well. And anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there is always BlackBoxNerd88 over on Instagram. And I will see you there for the bonus podcast. Until next time.